I stood in the parking lot of Peace Funeral Home in Aspen, staring at the snow piling up on my windshield, when my sister Claire walked out with a sealed envelope and a smile I'd never seen before. She stopped 3 feet from me, close enough that I could see the pearl earrings our mother always wore on Sundays, the ones Dad bought her for their 30th anniversary, and said the words that would crack my life wide open. Mom's gone, and I inherited everything. You're out. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and diesel from the street. She turned on her heel, her coat swishing against the frozen gravel, and climbed into a black SUV I didn't recognize, one with dealer plates and tinted windows. I stood there with my keys in my hand, breath fogging the air, my fingers going numb inside my gloves, wondering how a funeral for a woman who wasn't dead could feel so real. Then I remembered the document I'd found 2 days earlier in Mom's bedroom dresser, tucked under a stack of Christmas cards from 1987, and I smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to feel the cold air on my teeth. If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Let me take you back 6 weeks, to the day I drove up from Denver on black ice and bad coffee, because my sister had sent a group text saying Mom fell and we needed to talk about next steps. The text came at 6 in the morning, right when I was getting ready for my shift. I worked as a supervisor at a big box retail store, the kind with fluorescent lights that hummed and customers who treated you like furniture. The text said, Mom had a fall yesterday. Nothing broken, but we need to discuss her living situation. Can you come up this weekend? I read it 3 times, trying to find emotion in the words, but it was flat, businesslike, like she was scheduling a meeting with a vendor. I hadn't been to Aspen in 4 months. Work had been crushing me. My manager kept scheduling weekend inventory, and I kept saying yes because I needed the overtime to cover my mortgage after the refinance went through. The bank had pushed me into a higher interest rate, said my credit score had dropped after I'd missed 1 payment during a bad month, and suddenly I was paying $300 more every month just to keep the same house I'd lived in for 8 years. I told myself Mom was fine, that Claire lived 20 minutes away and checked in all the time, that I didn't need to hover. I told myself I was a good daughter even from a distance. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be convenient lies. The drive took 4 hours because of the weather. I stopped twice for coffee, once for gas, and spent most of the time arguing with myself about whether I should have come sooner, whether I was selfish for building a life in Denver instead of staying close, whether there was a right way to love your mother when you were just trying to survive your own bills and responsibilities. The mountains rose up white and sharp on both sides of the highway, beautiful in that way that feels aggressive, like nature reminding you how small you are. The house sat on a hill overlooking the valley, a 2-story cabin our parents bought in 1981 when land was still affordable, and Aspen wasn't just for the wealthy and the tourists. It had a green metal roof, a wraparound porch that needed new boards in 3 places, and a driveway that turned into an ice rink every December. Dad used to joke that the driveway was an IQ test, that if you drove too fast you'd end up in the ditch, and we'd all learn to creep up it in first gear with our hearts in our throats. I parked next to Claire's car, a silver sedan that looked freshly washed despite the snow, and grabbed the bag of groceries I'd picked up in town. Bread, milk, eggs, soup, the basics I figured Mom might need if she'd been laid up after a fall. I knocked twice before using my key. The lock stuck like it always did, and I had to jiggle it while turning to get the door to open. The living room smelled like pine and dust, and something else I couldn't place, something vaguely medicinal. Mom's reading glasses sat on the coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle from the newspaper. The television was on, muted, showing the weather forecast with a map of Colorado covered in blue snowflake symbols. The fireplace was cold. I noticed that immediately because Dad always kept a fire going in winter, and Mom had kept up the tradition after he passed. The cold hearth made the house feel abandoned, like no one had really been living there, just passing through. Claire appeared from the hallway, holding a mug of tea, her expression somewhere between concern and impatience. She looked good, better than I did, with her hair styled and her clothes neat and expensive looking. She'd always been the polished one, the one who figured out how to climb the ladder, make connections, present herself as someone who had it together. I'd always been the one in scuffed sneakers and clearance rack sweaters, the one who worked retail and drove a car with a dent in the passenger door. She hugged me briefly, The kind of hug you give a distant cousin at a wedding, all shoulders and no warmth. She said Mom was resting upstairs, that the fall had been minor but scary, that the doctor wanted her to take it easy for a while. I asked what happened. Claire said Mom had been reaching for something on a high shelf in the kitchen and lost her balance, landed hard on her hip. I asked if she went to the hospital. Claire said she drove her to urgent care, that they did x-rays and everything was fine, just bruising and soreness. I asked if I could go see her. Claire said not yet, that Mom was finally asleep after a rough night, and we should let her rest. Her tone was gentle but firm, the voice of someone used to making decisions and expecting others to follow. I put the groceries away in the kitchen, noticing how empty the fridge looked. Just a carton of milk with a use-by date from last week, some leftover soup in a plastic container, a wilted head of lettuce, and a few condiments. I opened the freezer and found it nearly empty too, just some ice cube trays and a bag of frozen peas. I asked Claire if she'd been staying here. She said no, that she'd been coming by twice a day to check on things, but Mom insisted on staying alone. She said Mom was stubborn about her independence, always had been, wouldn't accept help, even when she clearly needed it. I asked why we hadn't hired someone to come in and help with cooking and cleaning. Claire said Mom refused, got angry whenever it was suggested, said she wasn't an invalid and didn't need strangers in her house. I nodded, but something felt off. The dish soap smelled wrong, like someone had switched brands. Mom had used the same green bottle of dish soap for as long as I could remember, bought it in bulk from the warehouse store, but now there was a yellow bottle with a different label sitting by the sink. There was a stack of mail on the counter, all opened, all addressed to Mom. Bills, mostly. I could see the return addresses: electric company, phone company, property insurance, credit card. I started to reach for them, wanting to see if anything was overdue, but Claire cleared her throat, and I pulled my hand back. She asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast before school for 18 years, where Mom had helped us with homework and taught us how to make pie crust and told us stories about her own childhood in Nebraska. That's when she told me about Heritage Springs. It was a senior living facility in town, she said, one of the nicest in the state, with full medical support and activities and a community of people Mom's age. She pulled out a glossy brochure from her purse and slid it across the table. The cover showed an elegant building with big windows and a mountain view, and the words, "Live your best years with dignity and joy," printed in flowing script. I opened it and looked at the photos inside. Smiling residents playing cards in a bright room, a group doing yoga on mats, a dining room with white tablecloths and flower centerpieces, an apartment with a kitchenette and a private bathroom. Everything looked clean and expensive and completely unlike Mom. I asked how much it cost. Claire hesitated, took a sip of her tea, and said it was reasonable, considering the level of care. I asked what reasonable meant. She said around $7,000 a month, plus additional fees for medication management and any special services. My stomach dropped. $7,000 a month was more than my mortgage and car payment combined. I asked how we'd afford that. Claire set down her mug and folded her hands on the table. She said the house. We could sell the house, she said, and use the equity to cover Mom's care for years. She said property values in Aspen had gone up significantly, that the house was probably worth over $1 million now, maybe more with the right buyer. She said after selling expenses and closing costs, we'd have enough to pay for Heritage Springs for 10 years, maybe 15 if we invested wisely. I stared at her. I asked if Mom agreed to this. Claire's expression shifted, became more careful. She said Mom wasn't in a position to make clear decisions anymore, that the fall was a sign of deeper issues, that we had a responsibility to protect her even if she didn't understand what was best. I asked what deeper issues. Claire said forgetfulness, confusion, difficulty managing daily tasks. She said she'd noticed it for months, that Mom would forget appointments, repeat herself in conversations, leave the stove on. She said it was early-stage dementia probably, and it would only get worse. She said we needed to act now, while Mom could still adjust to a new environment before it became a crisis. I wanted to argue, wanted to say that sounded nothing like the Mom I knew, but I was tired from the drive, and Claire had always been better at sounding reasonable. She worked in real estate, dealt with numbers and contracts every day, and I was just a retail supervisor trying to keep my head above water. She had authority, confidence, the kind of presence that made you doubt your own instincts. I asked if we could talk to Mom first, together, before making any decisions. Claire said of course, but we needed to move quickly, because the waiting list at Heritage Springs was 6 months long, and there was one opening coming available in early January. She said the move-in date was January 15th. She said we had 5 weeks to get everything ready. I asked what getting ready meant. Claire pulled out a notepad from her purse, already filled with lists in her neat handwriting. She said we needed to clear out the house, sort through 50 years of belongings, decide what to keep and what to donate or sell. She said we needed to get the house ready for listing, which meant deep cleaning, minor repairs, maybe painting some rooms. She said we needed to pack Mom's essential belongings and help her settle into Heritage Springs. She said we needed to meet with a real estate agent, get the house appraised, set a competitive price. The list went on. She'd thought of everything, planned every step, and all I could think was that this felt less like a plan to help Mom and more like a plan to liquidate her life as efficiently as possible. I asked if she'd already signed anything. She smiled and said she'd just put Mom's name on the waiting list, nothing binding, just securing the spot. She said the deposit was refundable if Mom changed her mind, though she doubted that would happen once Mom saw the facility and understood how much better her life would be. I nodded and drank my tea and told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself Claire was just being practical, thinking ahead, doing what needed to be done. I told myself that taking care of aging parents was hard, and maybe I was lucky Claire was willing to handle the difficult parts while I stayed in Denver, pretending everything was fine. That night, I slept in my old bedroom, the one with the window that looked out over the valley and the bookshelf still full of paperbacks from high school. The bed was the same twin mattress I'd slept on as a teenager, and the walls still had the same pale yellow paint, though it had faded and cracked in places. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and the wind push snow against the windows. I kept thinking about the mail on the counter, all opened, and how Claire had said Mom wasn't in a position to make clear decisions. I kept thinking about the empty fridge and the changed dish soap and the cold fireplace. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Couldn't articulate it in a way that didn't make me sound jealous or paranoid or like a daughter looking for excuses not to face hard truths about her mother's decline. Around 2 a.m, I got up and went to check on Mom. I walked down the hallway in my socks, trying not to make the floorboards creak. Her bedroom door was slightly open. I knocked softly and heard her voice, clear and awake, telling me to come in. She was sitting up in bed, wearing her favorite flannel nightgown, the blue one with tiny white flowers, reading a book by the light of the bedside lamp. She looked tired, but not confused. Her eyes were sharp, focused, the same eyes that used to catch me sneaking cookies before dinner or staying up past bedtime with a flashlight under my covers. I sat on the edge of the bed and asked how she was feeling. She closed the book, keeping one finger between the pages to mark her place, and said her hip was sore but healing, that she'd just lost her balance reaching for a mixing bowl on the top shelf. She said it was her own fault for keeping things in such inconvenient places, but she'd lived in this house so long she couldn't remember where anything else should go. I asked if she was in pain. She said nothing a little ibuprofen couldn't handle, that she'd had worse injuries gardening or shoveling snow. I asked about Heritage Springs. Her face changed. The softness disappeared, replaced by something harder, more careful. She said Claire had mentioned it, but she had no intention of going anywhere. She said this was her home, the place she'd raised her children, the place where every room held memories of Dad, of birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesday evenings. She said she'd promised Dad she'd stay here as long as she could, that they'd chosen this house together, and she wouldn't leave it unless she had no other choice. I asked if she knew Claire was talking about selling the house. Mom's jaw tightened. She said Claire had suggested it, but she'd said no, clearly, multiple times. She said she'd told Claire to drop it, that the subject wasn't open for discussion, but Claire kept bringing it up, kept pushing, kept framing it as the only responsible option. Mom said she was tired of being treated like a problem to solve, instead of a person with a right to choose her own life. She asked me to promise I wouldn't let them take her house. I promised. She took my hand and squeezed it, her skin papery and cool, her grip surprisingly strong, and told me to check the dresser drawer, second from the bottom, under the Christmas cards. She said I'd find something that would explain everything. Then she turned off the lamp and said she needed to sleep, that talking about Claire always exhausted her. I went back to my room and lay awake until the sky started turning gray. I didn't check the dresser. I didn't want to believe my sister would do something that required hidden documents and midnight warnings. I didn't want to believe I'd been so absent, so focused on my own struggles, that I'd missed signs that Mom needed someone to fight for her. I told myself Mom was just anxious, that Claire was just being practical, that families had hard conversations about aging and nobody ever felt good about it. I told myself I'd stay a few more days, help sort things out, mediate between them, and everything would settle into something we could all live with. I was good at telling myself things that weren't true. I'd had years of practice. The next morning, Claire showed up early with coffee and a real estate agent named Bradley. She knocked twice, then let herself in with a key I didn't know she had. She called out that she'd brought breakfast, set a cardboard tray of coffee cups on the kitchen counter, and introduced the man behind her. Bradley was maybe 40, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive, and a smile that looked practiced. He had the kind of face you forget 5 minutes after meeting, pleasant but generic, and a handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Claire said she'd invited Bradley to do a walkthrough just to get a sense of the property value, no commitment, purely informational. I asked if Mom knew. Claire glanced toward the stairs and said Mom was still sleeping, that she'd been up late and we shouldn't disturb her. Bradley started talking about market conditions before I could object. He said Aspen real estate was hot, that inventory was low and demand was high, that properties with views and original character were selling fast. He walked through the house taking notes on his phone, commenting on the original hardwood floors, the stone fireplace, the updated windows Dad had installed in the 90s. He opened closets, checked the basement, examined the roofline from the backyard. He said the kitchen was dated but had good bones, that the bathrooms would need updating to attract high-end buyers, but overall the property had excellent potential. He said with some cosmetic improvements, the house could easily sell for $1.2 million, possibly more if they timed the listing right and marketed it to out-of-state buyers looking for mountain retreats. I felt sick. I stood at the kitchen window watching him pace the backyard, gesturing at the view, talking to Claire like they were discussing a stock portfolio instead of the place where Mom had planted tomatoes every summer for 40 years. Claire thanked him and walked him out to his car. I watched them talk in the driveway, watched Claire laugh at something he said, watched her pull out her phone and show him something on the screen. They stood there for 10 minutes, their breath fogging in the cold air, and when Claire finally came back inside, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright with something that looked like excitement. I asked her what she was doing. She poured herself another coffee and said she was being responsible, that I'd been gone for months and someone had to handle things. I asked what things needed handling. She said Mom's bills were piling up, that the property taxes were due in March, that the roof needed repairs, that the furnace was making a noise, that the driveway needed to be resurfaced. She made it sound like the house was falling apart, like Mom was living in a crumbling wreck instead of a perfectly functional home that just needed normal maintenance. I asked if Mom knew about any of this. Claire said Mom couldn't keep track anymore, that she'd found unopened bills, missed appointments, forgotten to refill medications. She said she'd been managing Mom's finances for the past 6 months to keep things organized, that someone needed to make sure the lights stayed on and the bills got paid. I asked to see the bills. Claire's expression shifted slightly, became more guarded. She said they were at her house, that she'd been organizing them in a filing system, that she could bring them by later if I really wanted to see them. I said I did. She said fine. She'd drop them off tomorrow, but I needed to trust that she was handling things correctly, that she wasn't making this up or exaggerating. She said I hadn't been around, hadn't seen how much Mom had declined, hadn't dealt with the daily stress of trying to keep everything afloat while working full-time and raising her own family. The words landed like stones. She wasn't wrong. I had been absent. I had made excuses. I had let her carry the weight alone because it was easier than facing how old Mom was getting, how fragile the life we'd built here had become. I spent the next 3 days at the house, trying to make up for lost time, trying to be useful. I helped Mom sort through boxes in the basement, old clothes and books and toys from our childhood, things that had been sitting in the dark for decades. She told stories about each item, about the Christmas I got the dollhouse, about the summer Claire broke her arm falling out of the tree in the backyard, about the year Dad built the shelves in the garage and cut the boards too short and had to start over. She didn't seem confused. She didn't repeat herself. She remembered dates and details and the names of people I'd completely forgotten. She seemed sharp, present, maybe a little slower moving because of her hip, but mentally clear as ever. Claire came by every afternoon with updates. The Heritage Spring spot was confirmed. The deposit was paid. The real estate listing would go live the first week of January. She'd found a moving company that specialized in senior transitions, people who knew how to handle estate sales and downsizing with sensitivity. She'd started sorting through Mom's paperwork, organizing decades of tax returns and insurance policies and medical records. Everything was happening, rolling forward like a boulder down a mountain, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it without looking like the bad daughter who didn't care about Mom's safety. Every time I tried to raise concerns, Claire had an answer. Every time I suggested slowing down, she had a reason why we couldn't wait. She was always 2 steps ahead, always prepared, always sounding more reasonable than I felt. On the 3rd night, after Claire left and Mom went to bed early, I finally opened the dresser drawer. I'd been avoiding it, telling myself I didn't need to snoop, that whatever Mom wanted to show me could wait until she brought it up again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that decisions were being made without my full understanding, that I was being managed rather than included. I went into Mom's bedroom, listened to make sure she was asleep, and carefully pulled open the 2nd drawer from the bottom. Under the stack of Christmas cards, beneath a layer of tissue paper, I found a manila folder. Inside was a copy of Mom's will, dated 2 years earlier, printed on thick legal paper with signatures and witness statements at the bottom. I read it twice in the dim light of the bedroom lamp, my hands shaking. Everything was split evenly between Claire and me. The house, the savings accounts, the small investment portfolio Dad had left behind, his pension benefits, everything divided 50-50. But there was something else, a handwritten note, paperclipped to the front page. It was Mom's handwriting, shaky but legible, written in blue pen on lined notebook paper. The note said, "If you're reading this, I need you to protect what your father and I built. Check the safe deposit box at First Mountain Bank. Account number 447. Key is in the blue jewelry box on the living room shelf. Don't tell Claire yet. Don't trust anything she says about my health or my finances. I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am being manipulated, and I need you to be my witness. Trust me. I love you, Mom." I sat on the floor with the folder in my lap, trying to understand what I was looking at. Mom wasn't confused. Mom wasn't incapable of making decisions. Mom was planning something, and she needed me to pay attention, to stop being passive, to stop letting Claire control the narrative. I read the note a 3rd time, memorizing every word, then put the folder back exactly where I'd found it. I went downstairs to find the blue jewelry box. It sat on a shelf in the living room, a small wooden box with flowers painted on the lid, the kind of cheap tourist craft you buy at a mountain shop and keep because it's pretty enough and functional enough. Inside were Mom's wedding ring, a few pairs of earrings, a tarnished locket with photos of Claire and me as babies, and a small silver key taped to the bottom with yellowed Scotch tape. I held the key in my palm, feeling its weight, its edges sharp against my skin, and tried to decide what to do. I could confront Claire now, ask her directly what was going on, demand to see the bills and the financial records she'd mentioned. Or I could wait, follow Mom's instructions, and find out what was in the safe deposit box before making any moves. I chose to wait. I'd already learned that Claire was better at arguing, better at sounding reasonable, better at making me doubt myself. I needed evidence before I could challenge her, needed something solid that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. I drove back to Denver the next morning, telling Claire I had to get back to work, that I'd used up all my available time off and couldn't afford to miss more shifts. She hugged me at the door and thanked me for being understanding, for seeing that this was the right thing for Mom, for supporting her through this difficult transition. I nodded and smiled and hated myself for staying quiet. I hated that I was playing along, pretending to agree, when everything in my gut was screaming that something was deeply wrong. But I didn't have proof yet. I just had a note and a key, and a growing sense of dread that my sister was stealing Mom's life piece by piece, while I'd been too busy and too tired to notice. The bank was in downtown Aspen, a brick building with a green awning and a parking lot that always seemed full. I took a half-day off work the following Wednesday, telling my manager I had a dentist appointment, and drove up through fresh snow that made the highway slick and terrifying. I parked on the street, fed the meter with quarters, and walked into the bank with the key in my coat pocket. The interior was warm and bright, with wood paneling and old photographs of Aspen from the mining days hanging on the walls. I walked up to the counter and told the clerk I needed to access a safe deposit box. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a name tag that said Linda. She asked for my identification and the box number. I gave her my driver's license and said box 4847. She typed something into her computer, frowned slightly, and asked if I was authorized. I said I was the daughter, that my mother had given me permission. She asked for my mother's name. I told her. She typed more, then nodded and said I was listed as an authorized user. She led me downstairs to the safe deposit box room, a cold basement space with rows of metal drawers lining the walls and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. The air smelled like concrete and old paper. She found box 447, used her key and my key to open it, and pulled out a long metal drawer. She carried it to a small viewing room, set it on a table, and told me to take my time, that I should come get her when I was finished. Then she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt final. Inside the box were 3 things: a sealed envelope addressed to me in Mom's handwriting, a thick folder of financial statements going back 6 months, each one printed from the bank's online portal and marked with dates in red pen, and a small recording device, the kind you use for voice memos, with a yellow sticky note attached that said, "Play me first." I picked up the recorder, my hands shaking, and pressed play. Mom's voice filled the tiny room, clear and calm and deliberate. She said she was recording this in late September, after Claire had come to her with a power of attorney document, asking her to sign it so Claire could manage her health care and finances more easily. She said she'd refused to sign it because something felt wrong, because Claire had been pushing too hard, asking too many questions about the house and the bank accounts and the value of Dad's life insurance policy. She said Claire had gotten angry when she refused, had accused her of being stubborn and difficult, had said she was making it impossible for anyone to help her. She said after that conversation, she'd started paying closer attention, keeping her own records, making copies of statements, watching what Claire did versus what Claire said. Mom said she'd discovered Claire had been telling people at church, at the grocery store, at her bridge club, that Mom was declining, getting confused, needing full-time care. She said none of it was true. She said she'd gone to her doctor in early October, asked for a full cognitive evaluation, and passed every test with no concerns. She had the documentation to prove it. She said Claire was building a false narrative, creating a paper trail of decline that didn't exist, and she believed Claire was doing it to gain control of her finances and her property. She said she'd tried to confront Claire about the lies, but Claire had turned it around, said Mom was being paranoid, said the confusion was getting worse, threatened to call Adult Protective Services if Mom kept spreading false accusations about family. Mom said she'd realized she needed proof, real documentation, someone on her side who Claire couldn't manipulate or intimidate. She said she'd been setting a trap, letting Claire believe she was winning, while quietly securing copies of every withdrawal, every forged signature, every piece of evidence. She said the Heritage Springs plan was Claire's endgame. Once Mom was moved to the facility, isolated from her home and her community, Claire would sell the house, claim the proceeds were for Mom's care, and the money would disappear into accounts Mom couldn't access. She said the will had a clause that invalidated any transfers or sales made under duress or through fraud, but she needed someone to enforce it, someone who would stand up to Claire when it mattered. She said she'd already spoken to a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Morales, who specialized in elder abuse cases, and Patricia was waiting for my call. At the end of the recording, Mom's voice softened. She said, "I love you both, but I will not let her destroy what your father and I built, and I will not go quietly into someone else's plan for my life. Please help me. I can't do this alone anymore." The recording ended with a click. I sat in the cold room, staring at the device, trying to process what I'd just heard. My mother's voice, so clear and strong, talking about my sister like she was a criminal. My sister, who I'd grown up with, fought with, loved despite our differences, who I'd trusted to handle things while I stayed away. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, like everything I thought I knew about my family had been a carefully constructed lie. I opened the folder of financial statements. They told a story that made my stomach turn. Claire had been withdrawing money from Mom's checking account for months. Small amounts at first, 200 here, 300 there, always with descriptive notes in the transaction log. Groceries for Mom, prescription refills, house repairs, medical copays. But the amounts had gotten bigger. $1,000 in July, $2,000 in August for something labeled emergency furnace repair, $5,000 in September marked specialist consultation and medical bills. The last statement, dated early November, showed a withdrawal of $15,000 with the description, property tax advance payment, escrow account. I pulled out my phone and looked up the county tax records for Mom's property. The taxes were due March 1st, like they were every year. The amount due was around $8,000. There was no advance payment option, no escrow account for a property that had been paid off 20 years ago. Claire had stolen $15,000 and called it taxes, confident that no one would check, that Mom wouldn't notice, or wouldn't be able to challenge her if she did. I opened the sealed envelope. Mom's handwriting covered 3 pages of lined paper, the kind she used for grocery lists and birthday cards. She dated it October 10th. She apologized for putting this burden on me, said she knew I had my own struggles, my own bills and pressures. She said she'd tried to handle it herself, tried to confront Claire directly, but it had backfired. Claire had gotten louder, more aggressive, started telling extended family that Mom was paranoid and declining, that she was making wild accusations because of confusion and memory loss. Some people believed Claire. Why wouldn't they? Claire was successful, articulate, the kind of person who sent thoughtful birthday cards and showed up to community events. Mom was old, recently widowed, living alone. It was easier to believe Mom was declining than to believe her competent real estate agent daughter was stealing from her. Mom said she'd realized she needed to play the long game, to let Claire think she was winning while building a case that couldn't be dismissed. She said the doctor's evaluation was the first piece, the bank statements were the second, the recording was the third. She'd been documenting everything, keeping a journal of Claire's visits, noting what was said versus what actually happened. She said Claire had been pressuring her to sign documents, claiming they were just updates to her medical directives, but Mom had read them carefully and realized they were financial power of attorney forms that would give Claire complete control. She'd refused to sign. Claire had gotten angry, said Mom was being difficult and ungrateful, said she was trying to help and getting nothing but resistance. Mom said the Heritage Springs plan was Claire's attempt to force the issue. If Mom was moved to a facility, Claire could argue she was no longer competent to manage her own affairs, that the move itself was evidence of decline. Once Mom was physically isolated, Claire would have more freedom to act, to sell the house, to transfer funds, to make decisions without oversight. Mom said she'd seen this happen to friends, elderly women whose children had taken control under the guise of help, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, the money was gone, and there was no way to get it back. She said she'd found Patricia Morales through a social worker at the senior center, someone who'd given a presentation on elder financial abuse. Patricia specialized in these cases, knew the legal system, understood how to build evidence and file for protective orders. Mom said she'd met with Patricia twice, shown her the documentation, laid out the timeline. Patricia said they had a case, but they needed to act carefully, that family court judges were often reluctant to intervene in family disputes, that we'd need clear evidence of exploitation and proof that Mom was competent to make her own decisions. Mom said Patricia was waiting to hear from me, that she'd told Patricia I was the trustworthy one, the one who'd do the right thing once I understood what was happening. At the bottom of the last page, Mom had written, "I know this is hard. I know you want to believe Claire means well. I wanted to believe that too, but the evidence doesn't lie. She's taking my money, planning to take my house, and trying to erase my voice in the process. I need you to fight for me. I need you to trust me over her. I need you to help me protect what your father and I spent our whole lives building. Please, I can't do this alone." I made copies of everything at the bank before putting the originals back in the box. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely feed the papers into the machine. The clerk Linda noticed and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, just dealing with some family stuff, the kind of lie that's so common it barely registers. She nodded sympathetically and said family stuff was the hardest stuff. I thanked her and left the bank, walking out into the bright, cold afternoon with a folder full of evidence that my sister was a thief and a liar. I called Patricia Morales from my car in the parking lot, the heat running, my breath still fogging despite the warm air blowing from the vents. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk but kind, with a slight accent that suggested Spanish was her first language. She said she'd been waiting to hear from me, that Mom had spoken highly of me, that she was glad I'd followed through. I asked if we could meet. She said yes, tomorrow if possible. That time was critical given the January 15th timeline. We agreed on 2 o'clock at her office. I drove straight to Mom's house instead of back to Denver. I didn't call ahead. I used my key and found Mom in the kitchen making tea, moving slowly because of her hip, humming something under her breath. She turned when she heard me, and her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hope, fear, relief. I said I went to the bank. She nodded. I said I heard the recording. She nodded again. I said I was calling the lawyer. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for months and said thank you. Then she started crying, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand, and I hugged her carefully, mindful of her sore hip, and told her I was sorry I hadn't come sooner, hadn't paid attention, hadn't been the daughter she needed me to be. She said it wasn't my fault, that Claire was good at this, good at presenting one face to the world and another behind closed doors. She said she doubted herself at first, wondered if maybe she was being paranoid, if maybe Claire's intentions were good, even if her methods felt wrong. But then she'd found the bank statements, seen the withdrawals, realized the amounts didn't match the stories Claire told. She said that's when she knew she wasn't imagining things, that her daughter was stealing from her while pretending to care for her. She said it was the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that made you question everything, every hug and kind word and expression of concern, wondering what was real and what was performance. We sat at the kitchen table and went through everything again. I asked questions, took notes, tried to build a timeline that made sense. Mom showed me other things she'd hidden. Bank statements from previous years showing when the withdrawals started. Emails between Claire and the Heritage Springs facility discussing the reservation. A copy of the real estate agent's market analysis with Claire's handwriting in the margins. She'd kept it all, organized and dated, knowing she'd need evidence to fight back. I asked why she didn't tell me sooner. She said she tried, in small ways, dropping hints during phone calls, but I'd always been distracted, busy, and Claire was always there to reinterpret, to say Mom was confused or forgetful. She said she realized she needed to wait until she had proof I couldn't dismiss, until the situation was urgent enough that I'd have to pay attention. I stayed that night and the next day, calling in sick to work, not caring that I'd already missed too many days this month. I met with Patricia Morales at her office, a small suite above a coffee shop, with windows overlooking the main street and mountains beyond. Patricia was maybe 50, with dark hair pulled back in a bun and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She reviewed the documents, listened to the recording, asked detailed questions about Claire's behavior, about Mom's health, about the family dynamics. She said we had a strong case, but it would be ugly. She said Claire would deny everything, claim the money was spent on legitimate expenses, argue that Mom was confused, and I was the one manipulating her. She said we'd need to prove 3 things: Mom's cognitive capacity, the unauthorized nature of the withdrawals, and Claire's intent to exploit. She said we'd file for an emergency protective order and temporary guardianship, citing financial exploitation and imminent risk of harm. The imminent risk was the January 15th move-in date at Heritage Springs. If Mom was moved before we could stop it, Claire would have control of the situation and it would be much harder to reverse. Patricia said she'd file the paperwork that week, that we'd likely get a hearing within 10 days, that I needed to prepare for Claire to fight back hard. She said Claire would hire a lawyer, probably claim I was the one exploiting Mom, that family court cases like this often became he said she said battles, where the judge had to decide who to believe. She said our advantage was documentation, clear paper trails that showed where the money went and how Claire's stories didn't match the facts. I asked what it would cost. Patricia said she charged $200 an hour, that a case like this could easily run $10,000 to $15,000 depending on how hard Claire fought. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't have that kind of money. I was barely keeping up with my own bills. She saw my face and said we could talk about payment plans, that she'd worked with families in similar situations, that protecting Mom was the priority, and we'd figure out the finances as we went. I nodded and signed the retainer agreement, committing to something I couldn't afford but couldn't walk away from. I didn't tell Claire about the safe deposit box or the lawyer. I went back to Denver and acted like everything was normal. It felt like lying, which I guess it was, but Patricia said we needed the element of surprise. If Claire knew I was building a case, she'd accelerate her timeline, possibly move money, possibly even try to move Mom into Heritage Springs early, claim there was an emergency that required immediate placement. So I answered Claire's group texts about the move, asked polite questions about the facility, pretended to be on board with the plan. She sent me photos of Mom's new room at Heritage Springs, a bright space with a window overlooking a courtyard, and I said it looked lovely. She asked if I could help pack up the house the week after Christmas. I said yes. Every word felt like glass in my throat. Christmas came. Claire hosted dinner at her house, a modern condo in town with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it came from an expensive catalog. Her husband, Mark, was there, quiet and agreeable, the kind of man who nods a lot and avoids conflict. Their 2 kids, both in college, were polite but distant, scrolling through their phones between courses, clearly wishing they were somewhere else. Mom sat at the head of the table in a green cardigan, smiling but tired, and I caught her looking at me 3 times during the meal with an expression that said, "Hold steady. We're almost there. Don't give anything away." We ate ham and roasted vegetables and a chocolate cake Claire had ordered from an expensive bakery downtown. The cake was beautiful, but tasted like cardboard, all appearance and no substance, which felt fitting. Claire talked about her recent sales, properties she'd listed and sold for impressive numbers, commissions that made my annual salary look like pocket change. She talked about Heritage Springs like it was a vacation resort, all the amenities Mom would enjoy, all the friends she'd make. Mom smiled and nodded and said very little. Mark asked me about work, and I gave vague answers about retail being challenging during the holidays. The kids didn't ask anything, just ate and scrolled and counted down until they could leave. When it was time to go, Claire walked Mom and me out to my car. She hugged Mom tight and told her the move was going to be wonderful, that this was the start of a beautiful new chapter. Mom nodded and said nothing. Claire hugged me too, thanked me for being supportive, said she knew this wasn't easy, but we were doing the right thing. I nodded and smiled and felt like I was going to be sick. On the drive back to Mom's house, neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. She said, "Soon," and I said, "Soon," and we didn't need to say anything else. The hearing was set for January 10th, 5 days before the Heritage Springs move-in date. Patricia filed the emergency petition on January 2nd, citing financial exploitation, unauthorized asset management, and coercion of a vulnerable adult. The court scheduled a hearing for that Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Claire received notice on January 3rd by certified mail. She called me 37 times that day. I watched the phone light up over and over, her name flashing on the screen, and let every call go to voicemail. The messages started polite and confused, asking what was going on, saying there must be some misunderstanding. By the 10th message, her voice had changed, gotten sharper, angrier. By the 20th, she was yelling, calling me ungrateful and deceitful, saying I'd ruined everything. I didn't listen to the rest. She showed up at my apartment in Denver that night at 9 o'clock. Pounding on the door so hard, my neighbor came out to see what was happening. I apologized to him, said it was a family issue, and let Claire in before she could make more of a scene. She stood in my living room, her face red, her hands shaking, her expensive coat still on, and asked me what I'd done. I told her the truth. I told her I'd seen the bank statements. I told her I knew about the unauthorized withdrawals, the forged expense reports, the fake property tax payment. I told her I'd heard Mom's recording. I told her I knew she'd been lying about Mom's health to build a case for incompetence. Claire called me a liar. She said I'd turned Mom against her, that I'd poisoned the family with paranoia and conspiracy theories. She said every dollar she'd withdrawn was spent on legitimate care, that she had receipts for everything, that she'd sacrificed her own time and energy to manage Mom's declining health while I sat in Denver pretending everything was fine. She said I had no idea how hard it was, how exhausting, how thankless to be the daughter who actually showed up, who handled the emergencies and the doctor appointments and the daily crises I knew nothing about. I asked her to show me the receipts. She said they were in storage. I asked which storage facility. She said that wasn't the point, that I was attacking her instead of focusing on what was best for Mom. I asked her to explain the $15,000 property tax payment. She said she'd already told me it was an advance payment, a prepayment to lock in the rate before potential increases. I pulled out my phone and showed her the county tax website, showed her that there was no such thing as advance payment, The taxes were due once a year and there was no prepayment option. She stared at the screen, her jaw working, and said I was twisting things, taking information out of context, making it sound worse than it was. I asked what the context was for stealing $15,000. She stepped back like I'd slapped her. She said she didn't steal anything, that she'd borrowed it, that she was going to pay it back once the house sold, that Mom would never even know. I asked if Mom consented to the loan. Claire said Mom couldn't consent. That's the whole point. That Mom wasn't capable of making those kinds of decisions anymore. I asked if she'd had Mom evaluated by a doctor to determine incapacity. Claire went quiet. I asked if she'd actually spoken to Mom's doctor or just assumed she could override his professional opinion with her own judgment. Claire said I was making a mistake, that this would blow up in my face, that I'd regret embarrassing the family in court. She said Mom needed professional care, that keeping her in that house alone was dangerous and neglectful, that I'd be responsible when she fell again or left the stove on or got confused and wandered outside in the cold. She said Heritage Springs was the best option, the only option, and if I'd been around more I'd understand that. She said I was being selfish, protecting my own inheritance instead of protecting Mom. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. I wasn't trying to protect my inheritance. I was trying to protect Mom's right to make her own choices, to live in her own home, to control her own money, to decide for herself when and if she needed more help. Claire left, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. I stood in my apartment listening to her footsteps pound down the stairs, listening to her car start and drive away too fast, and wondered if we'd ever speak again. Part of me hoped we wouldn't. Patricia called me the next morning. She said Claire had hired a lawyer, a man named Douglas Chen, who specialized in estate litigation. She said Douglas had already filed a counter-petition claiming I was the one exploiting Mom, that I'd manipulated her into signing documents while she was medicated after the fall, that I was trying to isolate her from family who actually cared. It was absurd, strategically predictable, and potentially effective. If Claire could create enough doubt about Mom's capacity and my motives, she might convince the judge to appoint a third-party guardian, which would delay everything long enough for her to move Mom into Heritage Springs and muddy the financial trail even further. Patricia said we needed Mom to testify, to appear in court and demonstrate her lucidity, her independence, her clear understanding of the situation. I asked if Mom was strong enough for that. Patricia said we didn't have a choice. She said judges needed to see the person at the center of the case, needed to hear directly from Mom about what she wanted and whether she understood the stakes. She said Mom needed to be prepared for aggressive questioning, for Douglas to try to trip her up, confuse her, make her seem less competent than she was. She said we'd do a practice session, prepare Mom for the kinds of questions she'd face, but ultimately it would come down to whether the judge believed her. I drove to Aspen the night before the hearing. Mom was waiting in the living room, dressed in a navy blue dress and her pearl earrings, her hair brushed and neat, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small, but fierce, like a bird that wouldn't back down from a hawk. I asked if she was ready. She said she'd been ready since September, that she'd been preparing for this moment for months, rehearsing what she'd say, gathering her courage. We sat at the kitchen table and went over her testimony. Patricia had prepared a list of likely questions, topics Douglas would probe, weaknesses he'd try to exploit. Mom answered every question clearly, without hesitation, her voice steady and her eyes sharp. I asked if she was scared. She said no. She said she was tired of being treated like a problem to solve instead of a person with a voice. She said she'd spent her whole life being polite, accommodating, making herself smaller so other people could be comfortable, and she was done. She said whatever happened in court, she was grateful I'd listened, that I'd believed her when it would have been easier not to. She said that mattered more than the outcome, knowing that at least one of her daughters saw her as a person worth fighting for. I hugged her and felt her bones through the fabric of her dress and wondered how I'd missed so many signs that she needed someone to stand beside her. The courthouse was downtown, a gray stone building with narrow hallways and a smell like old paper and floor wax. We arrived at 8:30 and waited on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. My legs bounced nervously until Mom put her hand on my knee to still them. Claire showed up at 8:50 with Douglas Chen, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a briefcase that looked heavy with documents. She didn't look at me or Mom. She wore a black suit and minimal makeup, styled to look professional and responsible. Douglas greeted us with a nod but didn't shake hands. Patricia met us outside the courtroom at 8:55. She wore a gray suit and carried her own briefcase, her expression calm and focused. She said the judge was Barbara Feldman, known for being fair but impatient, skeptical of family drama, intolerant of games or deception. She said we needed to present our case clearly and quickly, no emotional theatrics, just facts and documentation. She said the judge would make her decision based on evidence, not feelings, which was good for us because the evidence was on our side. The courtroom was small, just a few rows of benches and a raised desk for the judge. We sat on one side. Claire and Douglas sat on the other, with several feet of space between us that felt like a canyon. A court reporter sat below the judge's bench with her machine, her fingers poised and ready. At exactly 9 o'clock, Judge Feldman entered through a side door. We all stood. She was in her 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes behind reading glasses. She told us to sit, called the case number, and asked Patricia to present her argument. Patricia stood and laid it out step by step. The unauthorized withdrawals from Mom's account, documented with bank statements going back a year. The fabricated expenses, contradicted by county records, medical billing statements, and service provider confirmations. The plan to sell the house without Mom's informed consent, evidenced by emails between Claire and the real estate agent discussing timing and pricing strategy. The false narrative about Mom's declining capacity, contradicted by her doctor's evaluation from October showing full cognitive function. She submitted the recording from the safe deposit box as evidence, a CD in a plastic case that she handed to the clerk. Douglas Chen objected immediately, calling the recording hearsay and claiming it was made under duress, possibly when Mom was medicated or confused. The judge asked when it was made. Patricia said September 28th, according to the date stamp on the file. The judge asked if Mom was under medical care at that time. Patricia said no, that Mom's fall didn't occur until November. The judge overruled the objection. She said she'd review the recording herself during a recess and decide its admissibility, but for now it would remain part of the record. Patricia continued. She presented the doctor's written statement confirming Mom's cognitive health. She presented the neighbor's affidavit about Mom's daily functioning and independence. She presented the forensic accountant's analysis showing discrepancies between Claire's claimed expenses and actual spending. She said the pattern was clear. Claire had systematically taken money from Mom's accounts, created false justifications, and built a narrative of decline to cover her tracks. She said the Heritage Springs plan was the culmination of that strategy, an attempt to physically remove Mom from her home and community so Claire could complete the asset transfer without oversight. Douglas Chen stood to present Claire's defense. He said Claire was a devoted daughter who'd sacrificed her time and energy to care for an aging mother while her sister stayed conveniently absent. He said the money Claire withdrew was spent on legitimate care expenses, that she had receipts for everything, that any irregularities were honest mistakes made under stress. He said Mom's insistence that she was fine was itself evidence of impaired judgment, that many dementia patients lack insight into their own decline. He said keeping Mom isolated in a house where she'd already fallen once was dangerous and potentially neglectful. He said Heritage Springs was an appropriate level of care recommended by healthcare professionals. He did not specify which healthcare professionals. The judge asked to see the receipts. Douglas pulled out a folder and handed it to the clerk. The judge spent 5 minutes reviewing them in silence. Then she looked up and asked Claire to stand. Claire stood, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral. The judge asked her to explain the $15,000 property tax payment documented on the November statement. Claire said she'd paid the taxes early to avoid potential penalties. The judge said the taxes weren't due until March. Claire said she'd misunderstood the due date, that she'd been managing multiple properties and gotten confused. The judge asked why the money wasn't returned when the mistake was discovered. Claire hesitated, then said she hadn't realized it was a mistake until recently, that she'd been overwhelmed with other responsibilities. The judge asked Douglas if he had documentation of where the $15,000 went. Douglas said they were working on gathering additional records, that there might have been legitimate expenses around the same time that justified the amount. The judge asked what expenses. Douglas said possibly home repairs or medical bills. The judge asked if he had any evidence of those expenses. Douglas said not with him today. The judge said she'd wait. The judge turned to Mom and asked if she wanted to speak. Mom stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance, and I saw Claire's face flicker with something that might have been doubt or fear. Mom said she'd lived in her house for 43 years. She said she'd raised her daughters there, buried her husband from there, built a life that had meaning and deep roots. She said she understood she was getting older, that someday she might need more help, but that day wasn't today. She said she could still drive, still cook, still manage her own bills and appointments. She said she'd had a cognitive evaluation 3 months ago and passed every test. Mom said she'd trusted Claire to help her, and Claire had used that trust to take money without permission. She said the Heritage Springs plan wasn't about her safety or well-being. It was about control and money and erasing her voice. She said she was asking the court to protect her right to make her own decisions, in her own time, without being rushed or manipulated or treated like an inconvenient problem. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry. She stood there in her navy dress and pearl earrings and spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from months of being silenced. Douglas Chen stood up and suggested gently that Mom's testimony proved she was susceptible to outside influence, that I'd clearly coached her, that the real issue was her vulnerability to manipulation by whichever daughter got to her first. He said Claire had acted in good faith, trying to secure appropriate care, and any financial irregularities were understandable mistakes. He said the Heritage Springs move was still the best option, that Mom's refusal to accept help was a common sign of impaired judgment, and that the court should appoint an independent guardian to evaluate the situation objectively. The judge asked Claire directly, "Did you take $15,000 from your mother's account without her knowledge or consent?" Claire said she managed her mother's finances with her implicit consent. The judge said that wasn't what she asked. "Did you take the money without explicit permission?" Claire said her mother wasn't in a position to give permission. The judge asked if a doctor had declared her mother incompetent. Claire said no, but the signs were obvious. The judge asked what signs. Claire said forgetfulness, confusion, poor judgment. The judge asked for specific examples. Claire said her mother had left the stove on once, had forgotten a doctor's appointment, had repeated herself in conversations. The judge turned to Mom and asked if she'd ever left the stove on. Mom said once, about a year ago, when the phone rang while she was cooking and she got distracted. She said she'd smelled it within minutes and turned it off. The judge asked about the missed appointment. Mom said she'd written down the wrong time in her calendar, an error anyone could make, and she'd called to reschedule as soon as she realized. The judge asked if she repeated herself. Mom said sometimes, when talking to people who didn't listen the first time. The courtroom was silent, except for the court reporters typing. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end, the judge said she needed a week to review all the evidence before making a ruling. She said in the meantime, she was issuing a temporary restraining order preventing Claire from accessing Mom's accounts, making decisions about her care, or contacting her except through a neutral third party. She said Mom would retain full autonomy pending further review. She said if Claire violated the order, she'd face contempt charges and possible criminal investigation for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Claire's face went white. Douglas started to object, but the judge cut him off. She said she'd seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize the pattern, and this one had red flags on every page. She said the next hearing would be January 24th, and she expected complete financial documentation from both sides, with receipts and statements for every claimed expense. Then she dismissed us. We walked out into the cold January sun, Mom leaning on my arm, Patricia walking beside us with her briefcase. Claire stood on the courthouse steps with Douglas, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. As we passed, she said one thing, directed at Mom. "You'll regret this." Mom stopped walking. She turned to face Claire, her small frame somehow filling the space between them. She said, "I already regret raising a daughter who values money more than family, but I don't regret protecting myself from you." Then she kept walking, her head high, her steps steady, and Claire didn't follow. The week before the second hearing, things got worse. Someone started a rumor at Mom's church that I'd kidnapped her, that I was holding her hostage to steal her house. The pastor called Mom, concerned, asking if she was safe. Mom explained the situation and gave him Patricia's number so he could verify the facts. He apologized, said he'd been approached by someone spreading stories, and he should have checked before believing them. Mom asked who approached him. He hesitated, then said it was Mark, Claire's husband. Mom thanked him and hung up. Patricia said it was defamation, that we could add it to the case, but it would complicate things and possibly make us look petty. She said some judges saw family disputes as ugly dramas that both sides contributed to, and if we pushed too hard on peripheral issues, we might lose focus on the core financial abuse. We agreed to document the incident, but not pursue it unless absolutely necessary. Mom's doctor submitted a written statement to the court. Dr. Harrison had been treating her for 20 years. He said her most recent cognitive evaluation, conducted in October at her request, showed no signs of dementia or impaired decision-making capacity. He said she was physically capable of living independently with minimal support. He said Heritage Springs was designed for patients with moderate to severe care needs, and Mom didn't meet those criteria. He said he'd been surprised to hear about the planned move and would have recommended against it if consulted. He said in his professional opinion, Mom was fully competent to make her own healthcare and financial decisions. Douglas Chen tried to discredit the evaluation, saying it was conducted under optimal conditions and didn't reflect Mom's day-to-day functioning. Patricia submitted a signed affidavit from Richard, Mom's neighbor across the street. Richard was 82, sharp as ever, and he'd lived in the neighborhood since before Mom and Dad moved in. He said he saw Mom every day, that she was independent and capable, that she drove herself to the grocery store and the library, that she hosted her bridge club twice a month and never missed a game. He said the only time he'd seen her confused was the day after Claire had given her a sleeping pill she didn't normally use. He said he'd thought it was odd at the time, but assumed it was for pain management after the fall. Patricia seized on that detail. She filed a supplemental brief suggesting Claire might have been medicating Mom to create evidence of confusion, to build a case for incompetence through artificial means. It was a serious allegation, and we couldn't prove it, but the pattern was suspicious enough to raise questions. The financial documentation told the rest of the story. Claire submitted receipts for home repairs, medical expenses, and household supplies. Patricia's forensic accountant reviewed them and found problems everywhere. A receipt for a new furnace dated August that didn't match the furnace in Mom's basement, which was original from 1981 and still running fine. A receipt for prescription medications that Mom's insurance had already covered, meaning Claire was claiming reimbursement for expenses that hadn't been paid. A receipt for emergency dental work from a dentist who had no record of Mom as a patient and no record of the transaction. Claire had fabricated expenses to justify the withdrawals, and she hadn't bothered to make them believable under scrutiny. The accountant estimated Claire had stolen over $40,000 in the past year alone, possibly more in previous years that weren't yet documented. Douglas Chen argued weakly that the receipts were honest mistakes, that Claire had been overwhelmed with caregiving responsibilities and mixed up some paperwork from her own life with Mom's expenses. The argument fell apart under basic questioning. Why would Claire's personal furnace receipt be labeled as Mom's expense? Why would she claim reimbursement for medications insurance had covered? The explanations didn't hold. On January 24th, we went back to court. The judge reviewed the supplemental evidence, listened to brief statements from both sides, and made her ruling. She said the evidence of financial exploitation was overwhelming and undeniable. She said Claire had violated her mother's trust, fabricated expenses, stolen significant sums of money, and attempted to force a living situation that served Claire's financial interests rather than Mom's well-being. She said she was granting permanent guardianship to me, with full oversight of Mom's financial and medical decisions, subject to annual review. She said she was ordering Claire to repay $43,000 within 90 days or face criminal charges for elder financial abuse. She said she was referring the case to the district attorney's office for further investigation into possible fraud and identity theft. She said the restraining order preventing Claire from contacting Mom or accessing her property would remain in place indefinitely. She said if Claire wished to rebuild a relationship with her mother in the future, she could do so through supervised visits arranged by a neutral third party, but only if Mom consented and only after demonstrating genuine accountability. Then Judge Feldman looked directly at Claire and said something I'll never forget. She said, "You had an opportunity to care for someone who loved you unconditionally. You chose greed instead. You betrayed your mother's trust for money. That choice has consequences that will follow you for the rest of your life. The court finds your behavior reprehensible and your explanations insulting. I hope you spend time reflecting on what you've lost and why." Claire stood up, her face pale, her hands gripping the table. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closed it. Douglas Chen gathered his papers quietly and left the courtroom without making eye contact. Claire followed him, her shoulders hunched, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She didn't look at Mom or me as she walked past. The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt final. Mom let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. She reached over and took my hand. She said, "Thank you." I said, "I should have come sooner." She said, "You came when I needed you. That's what matters." We drove back to the house through fresh snow, the mountains white and sharp against the gray sky. Patricia had already submitted paperwork to reverse the Heritage Springs reservation and notify the real estate agent that the house was no longer for sale. The agent called me later that day, apologetic, saying he'd had no idea about the family situation, that Claire had presented everything as cooperative and planned. I told him it was fine, that he'd done nothing wrong, that we just needed to close that chapter. I'd taken a leave of absence from work, arranged through my manager with the understanding that my mother needed care during a family crisis. It wasn't a lie, though the nature of the crisis wasn't what most people assumed. I stayed in Aspen for 3 weeks, helping Mom reorganize her finances, setting up new account access with passwords only she and I knew, establishing a system where I could help monitor, but she retained full control. We didn't talk much about Claire during those weeks. There was too much pain, too much anger, too many questions about how someone we'd loved could choose money over family. Mom said once that she'd spent months wondering where she'd failed as a mother, what she'd done wrong to raise a daughter capable of such betrayal. I told her it wasn't her failure. I said Claire had made her own choices, driven by her own fears and greed, and those choices weren't Mom's responsibility to carry. The district attorney opened a formal investigation in February. They found additional evidence beyond what we'd uncovered. Claire had opened a credit card in Mom's name without permission, racked up $12,000 in charges for personal expenses, clothing, restaurants, a weekend trip to San Francisco, and made minimum payments that barely covered interest. She'd also forged Mom's signature on a home equity line of credit application, attempting to borrow $100,000 against the house. The bank had denied the application because of inconsistencies in the paperwork and because the property was in a trust, but the attempt alone constituted fraud. In March, the DA filed formal charges: 3 counts of financial exploitation of an elderly person, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of identity theft, and 1 count of attempted fraud. Claire's lawyer negotiated a plea deal to avoid trial. She pled guilty to 2 felony counts in exchange for dropping the rest. She was sentenced to 18 months probation, 400 hours of community service, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution of all stolen funds plus interest and penalties, a total of $68,000. She avoided jail time, but the felony conviction meant she lost her real estate license permanently. Her career was over. The consequences rippled outward. Clients she'd worked with learned about the conviction and canceled listings. Her brokerage firm quietly let her go. Friends and acquaintances who'd admired her success started avoiding her calls. Her marriage crumbled under the weight of shame and financial stress. Mark filed for divorce in April, citing irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the real reason. Their kids stopped visiting, embarrassed by their mother's public disgrace. Claire had gambled everything on greed and lost everything that mattered. Mom didn't celebrate Claire's downfall. She didn't gloat or express satisfaction. She sat in her living room one afternoon in May, looking out at the valley turning green with spring, and said she wished things had gone differently. She said she'd raised both of us to be strong and independent, to value integrity and hard work. But somewhere along the way, Claire had learned to measure her worth by external markers: money, status, the appearance of success, rather than by character and kindness. She said she didn't know where that came from, whether it was something she'd failed to teach or something the world had taught too powerfully. She said she still loved Claire, would always love her, but she couldn't have her in her life right now, maybe not ever. She said that was the cost of self-protection, and some costs were worth paying. She said maybe in 5 or 10 years, if Claire did the work to understand what she'd done and why, if she demonstrated real change over sustained time, maybe then they could talk, but not now. Now the wound was too fresh, the trust too shattered. I moved back to Denver in late May, but came up to Aspen every other weekend. Mom hired a part-time caregiver named Sarah, a woman in her 30s studying to be a physician assistant, who came by 3 times a week to help with grocery shopping, heavy cleaning, and occasional transportation to appointments. Mom insisted on paying her well, $25 an hour plus mileage, said good help deserved fair wages and dignity. Sarah was competent and kind, and over time, she became more friend than employee, someone Mom genuinely enjoyed having around. The house stayed in Mom's name. The taxes got paid on time, straight from Mom's account with her signature and her decision. The furnace kept running, just like it had for 40 years. Life found a new normal, quieter than before, but steadier. Mom joined a walking group at the senior center, started going to book club again, reconnected with friends she'd pulled away from during the months when Claire was controlling access and spreading rumors about her decline. She seemed lighter, more herself, like someone who'd been holding her breath and could finally exhale. The summer brought an unexpected phone call. Mark, Claire's ex-husband, called me in July. He said he wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner, for staying quiet when he knew something was wrong. He said he'd seen the receipts Claire was fabricating, heard her on the phone with the real estate agent discussing strategy, noticed the money appearing in their joint account that she claimed was from commissions, but the timing never matched her sales. He said he'd been afraid of her anger, afraid of losing his marriage, afraid of being painted as the villain if he chose sides. He said watching her self-destruct had been painful but necessary, and he understood now why it happened. He said he wished he'd been braver, wished he'd called me or Mom or the police when he first suspected. I thanked him for the call. I didn't forgive him, not fully, but I appreciated the honesty. He said he'd started therapy to understand why he'd enabled her, why he'd chosen peace over principle. He said he was trying to be a better man, a better father to his kids, someone who wouldn't look away from wrongdoing just because it was uncomfortable. I wished him luck. In September, almost a year after Mom recorded that message in the safe deposit box, she asked me to help her update her will. We sat at the kitchen table with Patricia, going through every detail with careful precision. Mom left the house to me with specific instructions. I could keep it and live there, rent it out for income, or sell it and use the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students from Aspen area high schools. She said she trusted me to make the right choice based on my own needs and circumstances, that she wasn't going to control my decisions from beyond the grave. She left her savings and investment accounts to be split between her 4 grandchildren, Claire's 2 kids and 2 cousins on Dad's side, with distributions managed through a trust I would oversee. The trust specified that Claire could not access the funds through her children, that the money would be released for education, first home purchase, or starting a business, with strict documentation required. Mom said she still loved her grandchildren and they shouldn't suffer for their mother's mistakes. She left Claire $1 and a handwritten letter sealed in an envelope. She wouldn't tell me what the letter said, but Patricia witnessed her writing it and sealing it, and Mom said it contained everything she needed to say to Claire, everything she'd held back during the court proceedings. She said whether Claire ever read it or understood it wasn't her concern. She'd said her piece and that was enough. Patricia said the will was airtight, written to withstand any challenge, with clear documentation of Mom's capacity at the time of signing. We filed it with the county clerk and gave copies to the estate attorney Patricia recommended. Driving home that night, Mom said she felt lighter, like she'd finally put her affairs in order on her own terms instead of someone else's timeline. She said that was all she'd wanted from the beginning: agency, respect, the right to make her own choices until she couldn't anymore. Claire tried to reach out once, in November, through a letter addressed to Patricia's office. She said she was sorry, that she'd been drowning in debt from bad investments and trying to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't afford. She said she'd convinced herself that taking Mom's money was temporary, that she'd pay it back once the house sold, and no one would ever know. She said she'd rationalized it as fair compensation for all the time she'd spent managing things while I stayed away. She said she missed her mother and wanted a chance to apologize in person. Patricia forwarded the letter to Mom and asked what she wanted to do. Mom read it twice, then put it in a drawer in her desk. She said maybe someday, but not now. She said forgiveness wasn't something you could demand on your own timeline, wasn't something you earned with a single letter. It was something you built through changed behavior over sustained time, through demonstrating real understanding of the harm you'd caused, through accepting consequences without demanding absolution in return. She said Claire hadn't put in that work yet. She said maybe Claire would. Eventually. Or maybe she wouldn't. And Mom was learning to be okay with not knowing. I asked if she thought they'd ever reconcile. Mom said she honestly didn't know. She said part of her hoped they would, that Claire would do the deep work of understanding why she'd made those choices, that someday they could have a relationship built on truth instead of manipulation. But another part of her doubted it would happen, doubted Claire had the capacity for that kind of self-examination. She said she'd made peace with both possibilities, that her well-being didn't depend on Claire's redemption anymore. Christmas that year was different. Just Mom and me and Sarah, who'd become a genuine friend over the months. We cooked a small turkey, played Scrabble by the fire, watched old movies Mom had loved since childhood. It's a Wonderful Life and White Christmas and Miracle on 34th Street. There were no speeches about new chapters or forced optimism about fresh starts. Just quiet contentment, the kind that comes from surviving something hard and choosing not to let it poison the rest of your life. We talked about ordinary things, Sarah's classes, my job search for something less soul-crushing than retail, Mom's book club arguing about whether the ending of their latest read was hopeful or bleak. We laughed about the turkey being too dry and the cookies being too sweet. We sat by the fire and watched snow fall outside the windows and felt grateful for simple peace. Now, 2 months later, I'm standing in the Peace Funeral Home parking lot, staring at my sister who just told me Mom died and left everything to her, and I'm smiling because I know the truth. Mom isn't dead. Mom is very much alive, sitting at home with Sarah right now, probably drinking tea and working on a crossword puzzle. This whole thing, the funeral home, the envelope, the dramatic confrontation, was Patricia's idea, a final test arranged with the probation officer's knowledge. Claire's probation terms included staying away from Mom and not attempting contact directly or through third parties. Patricia suggested staging this scenario to see if Claire had learned anything, if she'd respect the boundaries or try to manipulate the situation one more time. We sent Claire a fake notice about a funeral arrangement meeting, made it look official, and waited to see what she'd do. She took the bait. She showed up ready to claim everything, believing she could still manipulate the situation, still control the narrative, still get what she wanted through deception. The envelope she's holding contains blank paper and a note explaining that this was a test of her probation compliance. Patricia will submit the evidence to the court and the probation office tomorrow. The judge will likely extend the restraining order indefinitely. Claire will face additional consequences for violating the no-contact order, possibly including jail time for probation violation. I watch her drive away in the black SUV, which I now realize is probably borrowed or rented, one more piece of performance in her ongoing theater of appearance. And I feel something like pity mixed with relief. She still hasn't learned. She's still the same person, still chasing the same hollow things, still believing she can take shortcuts to what others earn through integrity. I get in my car and drive back to Mom's house, up the treacherous driveway in first gear, parking in my usual spot by the porch. The lights are on inside, warm and welcoming. I can see Mom through the window, sitting in her chair, Sarah beside her. They're laughing about something. I sit in the car for a moment, watching them, feeling grateful for second chances and difficult choices and the courage to protect people you love. I walk inside, and Mom looks up with that expression that says, "Well?" I tell her Claire took the bait, played exactly into the trap, showed up ready to claim assets that were never hers. Mom nods, unsurprised but sad. She says she'd hoped Claire would pass the test, would respect the boundaries, would demonstrate some growth. She says she's tired of tests and traps and having to prove she deserves basic dignity. She says this is the last one. From now on, if Claire wants back in her life, it won't be through schemes or lawyers or fake funerals. It'll be through the front door with honesty and humility, or not at all. I tell her that sounds fair. She smiles, the kind of smile that holds decades of love and disappointment and hard-won wisdom. She says, "Pour me some tea, sweetheart. And then tell me about your life for once, not mine. Tell me about the job applications, about that book you're reading, about ordinary things. I'm tired of drama. I want boring. I want normal. I want to hear about your world." So I do. I pour 3 mugs of tea, sit on the couch between Mom and Sarah, and talk about ordinary things. The job interview I have next week at a bookstore, my terrible luck with online dating, a recipe I tried that turned out inedible. We don't talk about Claire or courts or probation violations. We don't talk about money or inheritance or betrayal. We talk like people who've learned that the most radical act of love is sometimes just showing up, telling the truth, and refusing to let someone else's greed destroy what generations built with care and intention. Later that night, after Sarah goes home and Mom's asleep, I sit in the living room by myself, looking at the photos on the mantel, our family before everything broke. Mom and Dad on their wedding day, Claire and me as kids, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding hands on a hiking trail. Claire's graduation from college, all of us beaming with pride. I wonder when it started to go wrong, when money became more important than connection, when control became more valuable than trust. I don't have answers. Maybe there aren't answers. Maybe some people just make choices that take them further and further from who they could have been, and all you can do is protect yourself and the people you love from the fallout. Maybe that's enough. I turn off the lights and go to bed in my old room, the one I slept in as a teenager, and I sleep better than I have in months, because Mom is safe, because the house is still hers, because we fought and we won, not perfectly, but well enough. Because sometimes doing the right thing is hard and expensive and costs you relationships you thought mattered, and you do it anyway because the alternative is worse. In the morning, I'll call Patricia and confirm that everything went according to plan. In the afternoon, I'll take Mom to lunch at the cafe she likes downtown. In the evening, I'll drive back to Denver and return to my own life, knowing she's okay, knowing she's protected, knowing she has people around her who see her as a person worth defending. And maybe someday, Claire will do the work, make the changes, become someone capable of genuine relationship instead of transactional manipulation. Maybe we'll all sit around this table again and find something like forgiveness. But maybe we won't, and that's okay too. Because love isn't letting people hurt you repeatedly. Love is sometimes saying no, setting boundaries, choosing your own peace over someone else's comfort. Mom taught me that this year, not through words, but through action. Through standing up in that courtroom and refusing to be silenced, through trusting me with her truth when it would have been easier to give up, through showing me that there's strength in asking for help and courage in protecting what matters. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. That helps us keep sharing stories of strong women, families, and the unexpected turns of life.